April 17, 1943, Stalag Luft III, Sagan, Germany. As the bitter morning wind howled through the barbed wire fences, Staff Sergeant William Holloway stood at rigid attention, his dark skin contrasting sharply against the fresh snow as 5 German guards circled him like wolves. The Harvard-educated linguist had been told countless times that men like him would receive special treatment if captured, yet nothing could have prepared him for how his unique talents would transform not just his fate, but the entire camp's power dynamic. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how one man's extraordinary linguistic abilities became an unexpected weapon on a forgotten battlefield of World War II, where the war of words proved more powerful than any rifle, and how a prejudiced enemy came to rely on the very man they had been taught to despise. Sergeant William "Will" Holloway of the 392nd Fighter Group had been raised in a household where education was revered above all else. His father, James Holloway, was a professor of classical languages at Howard University, while his mother, Catherine, taught French literature. Growing up in Washington, D.C., during the 1920s, Will had absorbed languages like a sponge, starting with French and Latin at his parents' knees before branching out to German, Italian, and Spanish through his father's university connections. A mind that knows many tongues can never truly be imprisoned, his father often told him. It was a philosophy that had shaped Will's entire life, leading him to study linguistics at Harvard, where he added Russian, Greek, and Portuguese to his repertoire. By the time Japanese was added during his military training, Will Holloway spoke 9 languages with varying degrees of fluency, an extraordinary achievement that seemed almost wasted when he was assigned as a mechanic rather than an intelligence officer due to the military's segregation policies. Captain Thomas Reynolds of the 306th Bomb Group watched with thinly veiled disdain as the German officer strutted across the interrogation room. Reynolds had been shot down over Hamburg 3 weeks earlier, on February 25, 1943, and had quickly established himself as the senior American officer among the new arrivals at Stalag Luft III. A banker's son from Boston with piercing blue eyes and a square jaw that seemed perpetually clenched, Reynolds considered himself a pragmatist. Name, rank, and serial number. That's all any of you need to give them, Reynolds had instructed the 15 American airmen who had arrived with him. Anything else helps their war effort. Reynolds had followed his own advice meticulously during his initial interrogation, repeating Reynolds Thomas J. Captain 073421998 like a mantra until the frustrated Luftwaffe intelligence officer had finally dismissed him. Now, watching through the doorway as another interrogation was about to begin, Reynolds felt a twist of concern in his stomach. The German officer, Hauptmann Werner Kluge, was known among the prisoners as the Professor, a methodical, bespectacled man with an uncanny ability to extract information through conversation rather than coercion. Today, Kluge appeared particularly pleased as 2 guards escorted in a new prisoner. "Ah, a visitor from Africa, I see," Kluge remarked in German to his subordinate, loud enough for Reynolds to overhear from his position near the doorway. The casual racism made Reynolds wince, though he had expressed similar sentiments himself back home. Will Holloway stood ramrod straight, his face impassive, as the German officer circled him like a shark. His threadbare flight jacket still bore the evidence of the crash that had brought down his P-40 Warhawk while escorting bombers over Nazi-occupied France. 3 weeks of captivity had left him gaunt but unbowed. "Name, rank, serial number," Kluge demanded in English, his accent thick but comprehensible. "Holloway William T., Staff Sergeant 332578891, Will responded crisply. Kluge consulted a file on his desk. "It says here you are a mechanic with the, how do you say it, Tuskegee Airmen? Yet you were piloting an aircraft when shot down." Will remained silent, his expression neutral. "Come now, Sergeant Holloway. We both know you colored boys aren't supposed to be pilots," Kluge continued, switching tactics. "Yet here you are. I'm simply curious about this contradiction." Still, Will said nothing. Reynolds nodded approvingly from his vantage point. "Perhaps you lack the education to understand my questions," Kluge suggested, his voice dripping with condescension. Shall I speak more slowly? Will's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Klug switched to German, speaking to his assistant. These primitives can barely comprehend English, let alone respond properly to interrogation. Note that the subject appears incapable of complex thought. Reynolds couldn't understand the German words, but their dismissive tone was clear enough. He expected Will to maintain the same stoic silence that had served the other prisoners well. Instead, Will Holloway's voice filled the room with perfect aristocratic German. "I understand perfectly, Hauptmann. However, the Geneva Convention only requires that I provide my name, rank, and serial number, which I have already done." The shock on Klug's face was instantaneous, his mouth opening slightly as if he'd been struck. The assistant froze mid-note, pencil hovering above paper. "You speak German," Klug stammered, the power dynamic in the room suddenly shifting. "Yes," Will replied simply, still in flawless German. "Among other languages." Klug recovered quickly, switching to French. "And what other languages might those be?" Without hesitation, Will responded in equally flawless French, "I would prefer not to say, as that information could potentially be useful to your intelligence efforts." Reynolds watched in astonishment as Klug's face flushed red. The German officer barked an order to his assistant, who hurried from the room, brushing past Reynolds in the process. For the next hour, Reynolds observed an extraordinary linguistic duel. Klug attempted Italian, and Will responded with native-level fluency. The German tried Russian, only to be answered in kind. Spanish, Portuguese, even Greek. Each time Will parried flawlessly, refusing to provide any information beyond his name, rank, and serial number, yet demonstrating an education and sophistication that visibly unsettled his interrogator. When the camp's senior officer, Oberst Wilhelm Schaefer, arrived, he found Klug in an agitated state. "This prisoner claims to speak 9 languages," Klug explained in German, unaware that Reynolds could still hear them from the corridor. "9? Impossible," Schaefer scoffed. "I've confirmed 7 already," Klug admitted. "His German is better than mine." Schaefer studied Will with newfound interest. "Which universities did you attend?" he asked in German. "Harvard," Will answered, maintaining his formal stance. "A Negro at Harvard?" Schaefer's eyebrows rose. "Studying what?" "Linguistics and classical studies, sir." Schaefer switched to Latin, quoting Cicero, "Quis custodiet ipsos custodes." Without missing a beat, Will replied in the same dead language, "Who will guard the guards themselves?" From Juvenal's Satires. "Not Cicero, sir." Schaefer's face registered surprise, then something resembling respect. "Impressive, Sergeant Holloway. Most impressive." That evening, as Reynolds and the other new prisoners were shown to their barracks, Will was conspicuously absent. Reynolds inquired about him to a British flight lieutenant who had been imprisoned for nearly a year. "They've taken your colored boy to the officers' quarters for now," the Brit explained. "Quite extraordinary, really. Haven't seen the Germans this worked up since we tunneled under the latrine last spring." "But why the officers' quarters?" Reynolds asked. "He's an enlisted man." The British officer shrugged. "Schaefer's orders, apparently. The old man collects oddities. Has a private library full of banned books and a gramophone with American jazz records. Seems your man is the latest addition to his collection of forbidden things." 3 days passed before Reynolds saw Will Holloway again. The mess hall fell strangely quiet when the Black Airman entered, flanked by a German guard who unusually maintained a respectful distance. The segregation that had been a fact of military life back in America had initially persisted in the prison camp, with the handful of black POWs clustering together at their own table. Now, however, Will walked directly to where Reynolds sat with several other American officers. "May I join you, sir?" Will asked formally. Reynolds hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course, Sergeant." As Will sat, the men at the table exchanged glances. Finally, Lieutenant Jack Sanders from Tennessee broke the uncomfortable silence. "Is it true what they're saying, that you speak 9 languages?" "Yes, sir," Will replied simply. "Which ones?" another officer asked. Will counted them off on his fingers. "English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, Russian, Portuguese, Greek, And some Japanese, though my Japanese is admittedly the weakest. Christ, Sanders muttered. And the Germans? How are they treating you? A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, crossed Will's face. With confusion, mostly. They don't quite know what to make of me. That makes two of us, Sanders replied, though without malice. Reynolds leaned forward. Holloway, what did they want from you, after the interrogation? Will's expression turned serious. They're short on translators, sir. Oberst Schaefer has proposed that I assist with translating documents and communications between prisoners and guards. He lowered his voice. I've agreed with conditions. Reynolds frowned. That's collaboration, Sergeant. No, sir, Will said firmly. I've made it clear I won't translate anything of military value or assist with interrogations, but I can help our men make their needs known, ensure the Red Cross packages are properly distributed, and perhaps make life here a bit more bearable for everyone. Reynolds considered this. And Schaefer agreed to these terms? He did, Will confirmed. He seems to value education, regardless of its source. And frankly, sir, I think he's curious about me. Oberst Wilhelm Schaefer had been a professor of history at Heidelberg University before the war. At 58, he was considered too old for frontline service, but too valuable to be left completely to civilian life. His facility with languages and his understanding of Allied nations' histories made him an ideal camp administrator from the German High Command's perspective. What they didn't know, or chose to ignore, was Schaefer's private distaste for Nazi ideology and his increasingly doubtful view of Germany's prospects in the war. Schaefer's office was a reflection of the man himself, meticulously organized, yet filled with contradictions. Books by authors banned by the Nazi regime were hidden in plain sight, their spines reversed or their covers replaced. A photograph of Schaefer with African explorer and anthropologist Leo Frobenius sat prominently on his desk, a silent rebuke to Reich racial theories. Tell me, Sergeant Holloway, have you read Goethe in the original German? Schaefer asked, pouring a small measure of schnapps into 2 glasses. It was their 4th meeting in 2 weeks, each session ostensibly about translation duties, but inevitably evolving into wide-ranging discussions of literature and history. Yes, sir, Will replied, accepting the glass cautiously. Though I prefer Schiller, personally, Schaefer smiled. A romantic at heart, then. He raised his glass slightly. To the brotherhood of educated men. Will hesitated before raising his own glass. A brotherhood with very selective membership, in my experience. Schaefer acknowledged the point with a slight nod. Perhaps, but true education recognizes no color, wouldn't you agree? The ancient Romans didn't discriminate based on skin color, only on citizenship and class. With respect, Oberst, that's a convenient historical simplification, Will countered, and one that ignores more recent history, including that being written by your government. Instead of taking offense, Schaefer seemed pleased by the challenge. You speak of National Socialism's racial policies. Of course. Let me ask you this. Do you find it ironic that you face discrimination in your American army, yet serve it loyally against Germany? No more ironic than a man of your education serving a regime that burns books, Will replied evenly. For a moment tension filled the room, then Schaefer threw back his head and laughed. Touché, Sergeant. Very good. His expression sobered. We are both men caught between contradictions, it seems. Will neither agreed nor disagreed, simply sipping the schnapps and maintaining eye contact with the older man. I have a proposition for you, Schaefer continued. The camp library is woefully inadequate, particularly in English language materials. I'm willing to request additional books from the Red Cross. If you were to provide a list of titles. You want me to establish a proper library for the prisoners? Will asked. For all of us, Schaefer corrected. Knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied. Wouldn't you agree? Will considered the offer. And in return, I would appreciate your assistance with certain translations. Nothing of military significance, Schaefer added quickly. Personal correspondence, primarily. My English is serviceable but lacks nuance. Will's eyes narrowed slightly. You're asking me to read your mail? I'm asking you to help me understand the men I'm responsible for, Schaefer clarified. Their complaints, their needs, their perspectives. It would benefit your fellow prisoners as much as myself." Will was silent for a long moment, weighing the proposal. Finally, he nodded. "I'll need paper for the book list, and I want writing materials made available to all prisoners, not just officers." "Done," Schaefer agreed, perhaps too quickly. As Will was escorted back to the barracks that evening, he pondered the strange relationship developing between himself and the German commander. Was Schaefer genuinely interested in intellectual exchange, or was this an elaborate intelligence-gathering strategy? The line between collaboration and survival was thin in captivity, and Will was acutely aware of the suspicious glances some of his fellow Americans cast his way. Captain Reynolds was waiting when Will returned to the barracks. "Another chat with the Oberst?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes, sir," Will confirmed. "He's agreed to request more books and writing materials for the men." Reynolds nodded slowly. "Generous of him." "He wants something in return," Will admitted. "Help with translations, he says." "And what does he really want, do you think?" Reynolds pressed. Will met the captain's gaze directly. "Information, probably, though not the kind you might expect. He seems more interested in understanding Americans than in our military secrets." "Be careful, Holloway," Reynolds warned. "Men like Schaefer don't rise to their positions without being clever." "Yes, sir, but clever men can still make mistakes, like underestimating someone based on the color of their skin." Reynolds had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Just remember where your loyalties lie." Will's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "I've never had the luxury of forgetting that, Captain." As April turned to May, an unusual rhythm developed within Stalag Luft III. 3 times weekly, Sergeant William Holloway would meet with Oberst Schaefer, ostensibly to discuss translations and camp administration. These sessions became known among both prisoners and guards as the Professor's Hours, a nod to both Schaefer's academic past and Holloway's increasingly respected intellectual capabilities. The camp's power dynamics were shifting subtly. German guards who had initially treated Will with contempt now addressed him with a grudging respect. More significantly, American officers who had maintained their distance began seeking his counsel, first on practical matters involving communication with guards, then increasingly on personal concerns. By June 1943, the promised books began to arrive, crates of them, far more than anyone had expected. Classic literature in multiple languages, scientific texts, even contemporary novels published before the war. Will supervised their organization in a previously unused storage room that became the camp's library, cataloging each volume meticulously. "How did you convince Schaefer to get all these?" Lieutenant Sanders asked one afternoon, helping Will shelve a collection of Shakespeare's works. "I didn't," Will admitted. "I requested maybe 50 essential titles. This," he gestured at the hundreds of volumes, "this was his idea." Sanders picked up a German-English dictionary. "Seems like an awful lot of trouble for a bunch of prisoners who will hopefully be gone when the war ends." Will considered this. "I think he's building something that will outlast the war, a legacy of sorts." "A Nazi with a conscience?" Sanders scoffed. "That'll be the day." "Schaefer's not a Nazi," Will said quietly. "At least, not a committed one. He wears the uniform." "So do a lot of Germans who have no choice," Will pointed out. "Judge the man by his actions, not his uniform." Sanders seemed about to argue further when Captain Reynolds entered the library, his expression grim. "Holloway, a word," Reynolds said, gesturing to a corner where they wouldn't be overheard. Will followed, instantly alert to the captain's tension. "There's trouble brewing," Reynolds said in a low voice. "The new guards that arrived yesterday, they're SS, not Luftwaffe." "SS, in a Luftwaffe camp," Will frowned. "That's unusual." "Exactly, and they've been asking questions about you specifically." Will's pulse quickened. "What kind of questions?" "About your meetings with Schaefer, about the special treatment you've been receiving." Reynolds paused. "One of them is an Obersturmführer named Dieter Krause. He was overheard saying that having a black man teaching German literature to POWs is an affront to the Reich." "I don't teach literature," Will objected. "I just organize the books." That distinction may not matter to the SS, Reynolds warned. Be careful, Holloway. These aren't Luftwaffe officers with a grudging respect for airmen. These are true believers. Will nodded grimly. I'll watch my step. But avoiding notice had become impossible for Will Holloway. His unique position in the camp, neither fully accepted by his fellow Americans nor treated like other prisoners by the Germans, had made him conspicuous. The arrival of SS personnel merely focused existing tensions. Obersturmführer Dieter Krause made his presence felt almost immediately. Tall, blonde, and cold-eyed, he embodied the Aryan ideal celebrated by Nazi propaganda. Unlike the regular guards who had grown accustomed to the routines of the camp, Krause conducted surprise inspections and enforced regulations that had been allowed to lapse under Schaefer's more pragmatic administration. Will was cataloguing new arrivals in the library when Krause first confronted him directly. The SS officer entered silently, watching Will work for several moments before speaking. "So this is the famous Sergeant Holloway," Krause said in German, "the Negro who speaks like a Berliner." Will straightened, but didn't turn immediately. He took a moment to compose his expression before facing Krause. "I'm not famous, Obersturmführer, just a prisoner doing assigned duties." Krause picked up a volume of Goethe's Faust, examining it with exaggerated care. "These are not appropriate reading materials for prisoners of war." "Oberst Schaefer believes education benefits everyone," Will replied cautiously. Krause's laugh was cold. "Oberst Schaefer has been at this camp too long. He has forgotten certain fundamental truths." He dropped the book carelessly on a table. "Subhumans cannot truly appreciate the great works of European civilization. They can only imitate understanding, like a trained monkey imitates human behavior." The insult was delivered with such casual certainty that Will momentarily struggled to maintain his composure. Before he could formulate a response that wouldn't worsen the situation, Oberst Schaefer entered the library. "Obersturmführer Krause," Schaefer acknowledged with formal correctness but little warmth. "I wasn't aware you had an interest in literature." "I have an interest in security, Oberst," Krause replied, emphasizing Schaefer's rank slightly. "These books could contain coded messages. They should be examined more thoroughly." Every volume was inspected before being added to the library. Schaefer assured him, "My staff is quite thorough." "Your staff or your pet?" Krause's gaze flicked dismissively toward Will. A tense silence filled the room. Will remained perfectly still, watching the power struggle unfold. "Sergeant Holloway is a prisoner performing assigned duties," Schaefer said finally, his voice level but with an underlying steel that surprised Will. "If you have concerns about camp security, Obersturmführer, I suggest you raise them through proper channels, rather than disrupting established procedures." Krause's jaw tightened, but he offered a stiff nod. "Of course, Herr Oberst. I'll be sure to include my observations in my next report to Berlin." The threat was thinly veiled. After Krause had departed, Schaefer sighed heavily. "You should know, Sergeant, that the SS has been extending its authority over all prisoner camps," Schaefer said quietly. "It's only a matter of time before men like Krause are making the decisions here." "Why tell me this?" Will asked. Schaefer's expression was troubled. "Because I may not always be able to maintain the accommodations we've established." For the first time, Will felt a chill of genuine fear. He had been living in a precarious bubble of relative privilege within the camp, protected by Schaefer's interest and his own valuable skills. If that protection disappeared. "What do you suggest I do?" Will asked. Schaefer straightened his uniform jacket, his professional mask sliding back into place. "Continue as you have been, for now, but perhaps accelerate your English lessons for my junior officers." Will frowned in confusion. "Sir?" "One never knows when understanding the enemy's language might become valuable," Schaefer said enigmatically, "for anyone." The implications of that statement would only become clear to Will later. For now, he simply nodded his understanding and returned to his cataloguing work, though his mind was racing with new concerns. That night, Will shared Schaefer's warning with Captain Reynolds in the relative privacy of the barracks washing area. "He's preparing for something," Reynolds concluded, keeping his voice low. "The question is what?" "Maybe he's just being cautious," Will suggested. "The SS taking over wouldn't be good for anyone." Reynolds studied Will thoughtfully. You actually trust him, don't you? Will hesitated. Trust is a strong word in a prison camp. Let's say I believe Schaefer is a man who calculates his own interests carefully, and for whatever reason, those interests have aligned with making my situation here tolerable. And when they no longer align, Reynolds challenged, then I'll be in the same boat as everyone else, Will acknowledged. But until then, I might as well use whatever influence I have to improve conditions for all of us. Reynolds nodded slowly. Fair enough. But watch your back with Krauss. That man has something to prove and you're an easy target. As if to confirm Reynolds' assessment, the following weeks brought escalating tension to Stalag Luft III. Krauss and his SS subordinates began implementing stricter protocols, more frequent roll calls, reduced rations, harsher punishments for minor infractions. More ominously, several prisoners who had been caught attempting escape were not returned to the camp after their capture, their fates left unspoken but feared. Will's meetings with Schaefer continued, but with a new guard present at all times, one of Krauss's men, silent but watchful. The intellectual discussions that had characterized their earlier sessions were replaced by strictly administrative matters, translations of camp notices, clarification of orders, interpretation during meetings with the prisoners' representatives. During one such session in early July, with SS Rottenführer Müller standing stonily by the door, Schaefer slid a folder across his desk to Will. These need to be translated into English and distributed to the senior officers, Schaefer instructed, his tone formal. New regulations regarding work assignments and exercise periods. Will opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. Between the official papers was a smaller note, handwritten in Latin. Periculum imminens, prepare vestros, nocte tertia. Danger imminent, prepare your people. Third night. Will gave no indication that he had seen anything unusual, simply nodding and responding in the same formal tone. Yes, Herr Oberst, I'll have these completed by tomorrow. Sooner would be better, Schaefer pressed, his eyes conveying more urgency than his words. I'll do my best, sir, Will promised, closing the folder. As he was escorted back to the barracks by Rottenführer Müller, Will's mind raced. Schaefer was clearly warning of something scheduled to happen in 3 nights' time. But what? And how should they prepare? Captain Reynolds was equally puzzled when Will relayed the message privately. Could be a transfer, Reynolds speculated. The SS might be planning to move some of us to another camp. Or worse, Will said grimly. We need to alert the other barracks without raising suspicion. Reynolds considered this challenge. The baseball game tomorrow. We'll use it to pass the word. 3 nights from now, everyone needs to be ready to move or react at a moment's notice. The impromptu baseball game the following afternoon served its purpose perfectly. As prisoners from various barracks gathered to play or watch, Reynolds and his officers circulated among them, passing the warning in casual conversations that avoided the scrutiny of the guards. Will, meanwhile, found himself facing an unexpected moral dilemma. During his regular library hours, Oberst Schaefer's aide, Unteroffizier Dietz, approached him with unusual directness. Sergeant Holloway, Dietz said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. Oberst Schaefer has instructed me to improve my English. He suggested I seek your assistance. Will studied the young German, noting his nervous demeanor. Dietz was barely 20, a farm boy from Bavaria who had been assigned to administrative duties due to a childhood injury that left him with a pronounced limp. The Oberst seems very concerned about English language skills lately, Will observed neutrally. Dietz's expression confirmed Will's suspicions. It is prudent to be prepared for changing circumstances, the young German replied carefully. Will made a decision. Very well, we can begin now if you'd like. He selected a simple English grammar book from the shelf. Let's start with introductions and basic conversation. For the next hour, Will worked with Dietz on elementary English phrases, paying particular attention to those that might be useful in specific scenarios. Identifying oneself, explaining one's situation, requesting assistance. If Dietz noticed the practical nature of these lessons, he gave no indication, applying himself with earnest concentration. As their session concluded, Dietz asked hesitantly, "Would it be possible to continue tomorrow?" "Of course," Will agreed. "Same time?" Dietz nodded, then added in barely audible English, "Thank you, friend." The word friend lingered in Will's mind as he returned to the barracks that evening. Was he crossing a line by helping a German soldier prepare for whatever Schaefer was planning? Was this a betrayal of his uniform, his country, his fellow prisoners? Or was it simply a human response to another human being caught in the machinery of war? These questions remained unresolved as the third night approached. Security around the camp had tightened noticeably. SS guards patrolled more frequently, and rumors circulated that inspections from higher authorities were imminent. On the afternoon of the third day, Will was summoned unexpectedly to Schaefer's office. He found the Oberst alone, his normally immaculate desk uncharacteristically cluttered with papers. "Sergeant Holloway," Schaefer acknowledged without looking up, "I need these translated immediately." He gestured to a stack of documents. As Will approached the desk, Schaefer spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Kraus has received orders concerning specific prisoners. Tonight. My influence has been overruled." Will felt his blood run cold. Which prisoners? Political undesirables, Jews, those suspected of escape activities. Schaefer finally looked up, meeting Will's gaze directly. "And you?" "Me?" Will fought to keep his voice steady. "On what grounds?" "Your special status has been deemed ideologically incompatible with Reich principles," Schaefer quoted bitterly. "Kraus has been waiting for this authorization. Will struggled to process this information. What will happen?" "Transfer, officially," Schaefer said, his expression grave. "To a specialized facility near Berger." The implication was clear. Berger was known among prisoners as a death sentence, a labor camp where survival rates were measured in weeks, not months or years. "When?" Will asked, his mouth suddenly dry. 2 hours after midnight, a truck will come." Schaefer hesitated, then continued. "I have made certain arrangements. They are inadequate, but they are all I can offer." "Arrangements?" "There will be a 10-minute gap in the perimeter patrol on the north fence at approximately 23:30, Schaefer said precisely. "An equipment malfunction will disable the searchlights in that sector for perhaps 5 minutes. My driver will be conducting a supply inspection at the motor pool, with the keys to the Kubelwagen in the ignition." Will stared at the German officer in disbelief. "You're facilitating an escape?" "I am correcting an administrative oversight in security protocols," Schaefer corrected carefully. "What prisoners might do with such information is not my concern." For a moment neither man spoke. Then Schaefer added, "Only 3 can go. Any more would be noticed too quickly." Will understood the impossible choice being placed before him. 3 prisoners out of hundreds. Who would he choose? And more troublingly, why was Schaefer taking this risk? "Why are you doing this?" Will asked finally. Schaefer's expression tightened. "Because there are lines, Sergeant Holloway, lines that should not be crossed even in war, even in Germany today." He straightened, his moment of openness passing. "That will be all. See that those translations are completed before evening roll call." Will returned to the barracks with the authorized translations and the unauthorized message burning in his mind. Captain Reynolds listened in stunned silence as Will relayed Schaefer's warning and offer. "It could be a trap," Reynolds said when Will had finished. "A test of loyalty." "I don't think so," Will replied. "You didn't see his face. He's genuinely concerned. Even if it's legitimate, 3 men. How do we choose?" Will had been grappling with this question himself. "The 3 on Kraus's list with the least chance of survival," he suggested. "Lieutenant Abramson because he's Jewish, Sergeant Cooper because of his escape attempt, and you," Reynolds finished. "You're the 3rd man on the list." Will nodded reluctantly. According to Schaefer. Reynolds paced the small space between bunks. "I don't like it. If you're caught, the reprisals against the remaining prisoners would be severe. And if we don't try, 4 men are sent to Berger tomorrow," Will counted. "You know what that means." The moral calculus was impossible, the risks enormous either way. After lengthy discussion, they brought Lieutenant Abramson into their confidence, then Sergeant Cooper. The 4 men weighed options, considered alternatives, and finally reached a decision. "We go," Reynolds announced, "but not you, Holloway." Will started to object, but Reynolds held up a hand. You're too valuable here. Too many men depend on your skills as a translator. I'll go in your place. Captain, with respect, Will began. It's decided, Reynolds said firmly. This isn't about who deserves to escape. It's about who can do the most good where. You're needed here. Will wanted to argue further, but the logic was sound. His ability to communicate with the German staff did protect many prisoners from misunderstandings that could turn deadly. Still, the idea of sending others to risk their lives while he remained behind was deeply uncomfortable. What about the third spot? Lieutenant Abramson asked. If not Holloway, then who? Reynolds considered the question. Technical Sergeant Miller. He has a wife expecting their first child, and he knows the terrain in this region better than most. The decision made, the men spent the remaining daylight hours making subtle preparations. Extra food was secreted into pockets. Maps copied from memory were carefully drawn on scraps of paper. Critical phrases in German were memorized. As evening roll call approached, Will had one last task to complete. Finding Unteroffizier Dietz in the administrative building, he delivered the completed translations to Schaefer's office, then asked for a moment to review a grammar question with the young German. In the corridor, Will spoke rapidly in a mix of simple English and German. Tonight, North Fence, 23:30. 3 men. Dietz's eyes widened, but he gave a nearly imperceptible nod of understanding. Not me, Will added. Tell him. Another nod. And Dietz hurried away, his slight limp more pronounced under stress. Evening roll call came and went without incident. The prisoners returned to their barracks as darkness fell, the camp settling into its nighttime routine. SS guards patrolled more frequently than usual, but otherwise nothing seemed amiss. In Barracks 7, Reynolds, Abramson, and Miller made final preparations, while Will and Cooper created distractions, engaging guards in conversations at strategic moments and arranging minor commotion to draw attention away from the North Fence area. At 23:15, Will approached the barracks door for his prearranged smoke break, a privilege occasionally granted to prisoners who assisted with camp administration. The guard, a Luftwaffe corporal who had come to know Will over the months, nodded permission. 5 minutes, Holloway, the guard reminded him. Not like last time. Of course, Corporal Bauer, Will agreed amicably. Just needed some fresh air. As Will lit his cigarette in the doorway, he caught sight of Reynolds, Abramson, and Miller moving silently between shadows toward the north perimeter. His heart pounded as he deliberately engaged Bauer in conversation, speaking just loudly enough to mask any sounds from the darkness beyond. Beautiful night, isn't it? Will remarked in German. Reminds me of autumn evenings at university. You and your universities, Bauer scoffed, though without real malice. Always talking about books and learning. Education is the one thing they can't take from you, Will replied, keeping his eyes fixed on Bauer rather than allowing them to drift toward the escaping prisoners. Humph. Tell that to my brother. 6 years of school, and what good did it do him? Dead in Russia all the same. Will's practiced response faltered at the unexpected personal revelation. I'm sorry to hear that. Bauer shrugged, the gesture visible in the dim light. War takes from everyone, even the victors. Do you still believe Germany will be victorious? Will asked quietly. The guard's silence was answer enough. After a moment, he checked his watch. Time's up, Holloway, back inside. Will took a final drag from his cigarette, stamped it out carefully, and returned to the barracks. As the door closed behind him, the searchlights on the north perimeter suddenly went dark. The next few hours were the longest of Will's life. He lay on his bunk, fully dressed, listening to every sound outside the barracks. Sergeant Cooper did the same, both men prepared to create distractions if alarm sirens wailed. But the night remained eerily quiet. No sirens, no shouting, no gunfire. Just the occasional sound of regular patrols passing the barracks. Dawn approached without incident, and Will began to hope that Reynolds and the others had made it beyond the immediate search area. Then, just as the eastern sky was lightening, the camp's sirens finally blared to life. Prisoners were rousted from their bunks and assembled in the yard for an emergency roll call. Will stood at attention in his usual position, face impassive as the guards counted and recounted, confirming what they already suspected. 3 prisoners were missing. Obersturmführer Krause was incandescent with rage. He stalked the lines of prisoners, his face contorted with fury. "Who helped them?" he demanded in German, then switched to accented English. "Who knew of this escape?" No one spoke. No one moved. Kraus stopped directly in front of Will. "You," he snarled, "the translator, the Oberst's pet. You must have known." Will met Kraus's gaze steadily, saying nothing. "Search his quarters," Kraus ordered a pair of SS guards. "Every inch." While the search was conducted, the prisoners remained at attention in the yard. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The morning sun rose higher, beating down on them mercilessly. Finally, the SS guards returned, conferring briefly with Kraus. Whatever they reported clearly didn't satisfy him. His eyes narrowed as he returned to stand before Will. "Sergeant William Holloway," Kraus said formally, "you are hereby placed in solitary confinement pending investigation into your role in this escape." Still, Will said nothing, his expression revealing nothing. "Take him," Kraus ordered. As the guards moved to escort Will away, Oberst Schaefer's voice cut through the tension. "Obersturmführer Kraus." Schaefer approached from the direction of his office, his uniform immaculate, his bearing authoritative. "May I ask what evidence you have that Sergeant Holloway was involved in this incident?" "He is the only prisoner with special access to administrative areas," Kraus replied. "The timing is suspicious, given the orders we received yesterday." "The orders regarding prisoner transfers?" Schaefer clarified, his tone neutral. "Orders that only you and I were aware of?" Kraus's jaw tightened. He must have overheard or been informed. "By whom, Obersturmführer?" "Me." Schaefer's voice took on a dangerous edge. "Are you accusing a German officer of treason?" The assembled prisoners watched this power struggle in tense silence, few understanding the German words, but all recognizing the confrontation's significance. Kraus took a step back, suddenly aware of the corner he was painting himself into. "Of course not, Herr Oberst. I merely suggest that the prisoner may have sources of information." "Then investigate those sources," Schaefer said firmly, "but do so within proper protocols. Sergeant Holloway will remain under increased supervision, but not in solitary confinement, unless evidence warrants such measures." For a moment, it seemed Kraus might challenge this decision. Then, with visible effort, he composed himself. "As you wish, Herr Oberst, for now." The implicit threat hung in the air between them. Schaefer turned to address the assembled prisoners in English. "3 of your comrades have escaped. This is a violation of camp regulations and will result in privileges being restricted for all prisoners until further notice. Recreational activities are suspended. Red Cross packages will be held for inspection. Barracks inspections will be conducted randomly day and night." He paused, surveying the rows of men. "However, I give you my word as an officer that no punitive measures beyond these restrictions will be implemented without direct orders from higher authority." It was a small reassurance, but significant given the circumstances. Will understood the message hidden within Schaefer's words. The Oberst was still, for the moment, in command. As the prisoners were dismissed to their barracks, Will found himself walking beside Sergeant Cooper, who murmured under his breath, "What now?" "Now we wait," Will replied quietly, "and hope they made it far enough before the alarm was raised." "And Kraus." Will glanced toward the SS officer, who was conferring with his subordinates, his expression cold and calculating. "He won't give up. He'll be watching me constantly now." "Watching us all," Cooper corrected. "The whole camp's under a microscope." The prediction proved accurate. In the days that followed, Stalag Luft 3 was transformed. SS guards replaced Luftwaffe personnel at key positions. Barracks were searched thoroughly and frequently. Prisoners found themselves restricted to minimal movement within the camp. Will's position became particularly precarious. His translation duties continued. They were too valuable to discard entirely, but always under the watchful eyes of SS guards rather than the more familiar and lenient Luftwaffe soldiers. His access to Schaefer was severely limited, their meetings conducted formally and briefly, with Kraus or his deputy always present. A week after the escape, the first reports began filtering into the camp. A farmer had been caught helping 3 Allied airmen. Patrols had found evidence of passage through a forest 30 kilometers to the east. A stolen vehicle had been recovered near the Czech border. Then, silence. No official announcement of captures or deaths. No information at all. Will clung to this absence of news as a positive sign. If Reynolds, Abramson, and Miller had been caught or killed, Krauss would surely have made a public example of them. The lack of information suggested they might still be free, still making their way toward Allied lines or neutral territory. As July turned to August, the atmosphere in the camp shifted again. The initial crackdown gradually eased as no further escape attempts materialized. Recreational privileges were partially restored, though under heavier guard. Red Cross packages began to be distributed again, albeit with certain items confiscated. More significantly, rumors began circulating that Krauss was being reassigned. Will heard this first from Unteroffizier Dietz during a carefully monitored translation session. "The Obersturmführer has been ordered to a camp in the east," Dietz murmured in German, ostensibly asking for clarification on a document. His failure to prevent the escape has been noted unfavorably by his superiors. Will maintained a neutral expression, acknowledging the information with the barest nod as he continued his work. If true, Krauss's departure would remove the most immediate threat to his safety, though the structural danger of the SS presence in the camp would remain. 3 days later, the rumor was confirmed. During morning roll call, Oberst Schäfer introduced a new officer, Untersturmführer Keller, a young, thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who would be replacing the departing Krauss. The transition seemed to signal a subtle return to the previous equilibrium, with Luftwaffe protocols once again taking precedence over SS procedures in day-to-day camp operations. In mid-August, an unexpected development brought fresh tension to Will's situation. A new group of American prisoners arrived at the camp, among them another black airman, Flight Officer Marcus Jenkins of the 99th Fighter Squadron, another Tuskegee airman, whose P-51 had been shot down during a mission over Italy. Jenkins, unlike Will, had been commissioned as an officer despite the military's reluctance to promote black personnel to leadership positions. His presence created an immediate procedural question. Would he be housed with other American officers, segregated with Will and the handful of other black prisoners, or given some other accommodation? The question reached Oberst Schäfer, who summoned both Will and Jenkins to his office. Untersturmführer Keller was present, observing with curious detachment as Schäfer addressed the matter. "Flight Officer Jenkins," Schäfer began in English, "according to Geneva Convention protocols, officers are entitled to separate quarters from enlisted personnel. However, American practice has been to segregate troops by race." He glanced at Will. "What is your preference in this matter?" Jenkins, a tall, confident man with intelligent eyes, appeared momentarily taken aback by being offered a choice. "Sir, with respect, I'd prefer to be housed according to my rank with the other officers." Schäfer nodded, then turned to Will. "Sergeant Holloway, you have been here longer. What would you advise?" Will considered the question carefully. "The practical reality, Herr Oberst, is that Officer Jenkins may face hostility in either location. Some white officers will resent his presence, while enlisted men might find it difficult to show proper deference to a black officer." Jenkins frowned at this assessment. "I can handle whatever reception I get." "I don't doubt that, sir," Will replied with formal correctness, "but the situation affects more than just us. It could create tensions that impact all prisoners." Schäfer listened to this exchange with interest. "A diplomatic answer, Sergeant, but not a recommendation." Will met Schäfer's gaze directly. "My recommendation is to house Officer Jenkins with the other American officers, as would be done with any white officer of equivalent rank. To do otherwise would be to perpetuate an inequity that has no place even in a prison camp." Untersturmführer Keller spoke for the first time, addressing Schäfer in German. "Is it wise to challenge their customs? It could create difficulties." "Their customs are not our concern," Schäfer replied in the same language. "The efficient administration of this camp is." He switched back to English. "Flight Officer Jenkins will be assigned quarters with the American officers, as his rank entitles him. Sergeant Holloway, please explain the decision to Captain Harrison, the senior American officer, since Captain Reynolds." Departure. The way Schäfer phrased the reference to Reynolds, carefully avoiding any mention of escape, struck Will as significant. Was the Oberst signaling that he still had no official confirmation of the escapee's fate? Yes, Herr Oberst, Will acknowledged, filing away this observation for later consideration. As they were dismissed, Jenkins fell into step beside Will in the corridor. That was interesting, the flight officer remarked quietly. The old German almost seemed, fair. Schaefer is complicated, Will replied, keeping his voice low. He respects education and rank, if not necessarily race. Don't mistake pragmatism for enlightenment. Jenkins studied Will with newfound curiosity. You've been here a while, haven't you? How many languages do you actually speak? 9, Will answered, though my Japanese needs work. Jenkins whistled softly. No wonder they treat you different. He hesitated, then asked, Is it true what they're saying? That you helped 3 men escape last month? Will stopped walking, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. Officer Jenkins, with respect, questions like that can get people killed in a place like this. Jenkins nodded, accepting the rebuke. Understood, and it's Marcus when the Germans aren't around. Will, Holloway offered in return, and for what it's worth, I'm glad Schaefer made the right call about your quarters. Just watch your back with the other officers. Not everyone will welcome the precedent you're setting. Jenkins' integration into the officers' quarters proceeded with less friction than Will had feared. Captain Harrison, a pragmatic Midwesterner who had assumed leadership after Reynolds's escape, made it clear that any disruption would be dealt with severely. Most officers, whatever their personal feelings about racial integration, recognized that solidarity among prisoners transcended civilian prejudices. Still, Jenkins often sought out Will's company during the limited recreational periods that had been restored. The two men found common ground, not just in their shared race but in their intellectual interests. Jenkins had studied engineering at Howard University before the war, and in their commitment to proving the capabilities of black servicemen. After the war, Jenkins said during one such conversation, they won't be able to put this genie back in the bottle. Too many of us have flown planes, led men, proven ourselves. Will wasn't so certain. They'll try. History doesn't move in a straight line, Marcus. There's always pushback against progress. Cynical for a young man, Jenkins observed. Realistic, Will countered. My father was a decorated soldier in the last war, came home to a country that still wouldn't serve him at certain restaurants. My Harvard degree won't change the color of my skin when I return. Jenkins considered this, then said, Maybe not. But it's not just about us anymore. The Germans here have seen you speak 9 languages, organize a library, translate complex documents. The white officers have seen that a black officer functions just like any other. These experiences change people, even if they don't admit it. Will wasn't entirely convinced, but he appreciated Jenkins' optimism. In truth, he had observed some shifts in attitude among both prisoners and guards during his time at Stalag Luft III. Lieutenant Sanders, once openly suspicious of Will's privileged position, now sought his advice regularly. Several Luftwaffe guards who had initially treated him with contempt now addressed him with the same professional courtesy they showed other prisoners. Even Untersturmführer Keller, the SS officer who had replaced Krauss, seemed to regard Will with curious interest rather than ideological disdain. During inspections, Keller would often linger near the library, observing Will's work with the air of someone conducting a study rather than enforcing discipline. In late September 1943, as autumn began to chill the air around Stalag Luft III, a series of developments dramatically altered the camp's dynamics once again. First came news of Italy's surrender to the Allies, a political earthquake that visibly shook the confidence of many German guards. Will observed Unteroffizier Dietz and others huddled around a radio, their expressions grim as they absorbed the implications of a former Axis power switching sides. Then, more personally significant, Will received a summons to Schaefer's office one crisp morning. He arrived to find the Oberst alone for the first time in months, no SS observers present. Sergeant Holloway, Schaefer greeted him, gesturing to the familiar chair across from his desk. Please sit. Will complied, noting a certain weariness in Schaefer's bearing that hadn't been present before. You wanted to see me, Herr Oberst? Yes. Schaefer slid a folded newspaper across the desk. I thought this might interest you. Will opened the paper cautiously. It was a Swiss publication, dated 2 weeks earlier. On the third page, a small item caught his eye. 3 Allied airmen reached Swiss territory after daring escape. Though no names were mentioned, the article described American airmen who had escaped from a German prison camp and traversed hundreds of kilometers of enemy territory before crossing into neutral Switzerland. The details were sparse but suggestive enough to raise Will's hopes. "Is this, He began, looking up at Schaefer. The Oberst's expression remained carefully neutral. "I couldn't say with certainty, but the timing and circumstances are suggestive." Will refolded the newspaper, his heart racing. Reynolds, Abramson, and Miller might have made it to safety after all. "Thank you for sharing this, Herr Oberst." Schaefer waved away the gratitude. "The purpose of our meeting is actually more official." He produced a document from a folder. "I have received orders regarding your status, Sergeant Holloway." Will tensed immediately, preparing for bad news. "You are to be transferred," Schaefer continued, "to a new facility being established for prisoners with specialized skills, translators, engineers, medical personnel, individuals whose talents can be of use to the Reich." "What kind of use?" Will asked cautiously. "Administrative, primarily," Schaefer replied, "though I cannot speak to the specific intentions of those in charge." Will processed this information, trying to determine whether this transfer represented an improvement or a deterioration of his circumstances. "When?" 3 days from now, a transport is being arranged." Schaefer hesitated, then added, "I should note that this facility is under SS administration, not Luftwaffe." And there it was, the underlying threat. An SS-run camp would have none of the mitigating factors that had made Will's time at Stalag Luftwaffe survivable. No Schaefer to recognize his humanity. No established relationships with guards. No protection through usefulness. "I see," Will said, keeping his voice level with effort. Schaefer stood and moved to the window, looking out over the camp with his back to Will. "The war is changing, Sergeant Holloway. Italy has surrendered. The Eastern Front is not progressing as hoped. Certain elements within the Reich are becoming more desperate, more extreme in their methods." Will remained silent, sensing that Schaefer was building to something. "In such times," the Oberst continued, "a man must consider what legacy he wishes to leave. What stories will be told of him when the fighting ends?" He turned to face Will again. "I have been commanding prison camps for 3 years. In that time I have attempted to maintain certain standards, certain principles." "You've been fair," Will acknowledged, "more fair than many." Schaefer smiled thinly. "Fairness is a luxury in wartime. I have simply tried to remember that prisoners are still men." He returned to his desk, sitting heavily. "Your transfer orders are problematic. The destination is concerning, the timing is suspicious." "Suspicious how?" Will asked. "They coincide with a scheduled inspection by officers from Berlin, officers who might notice if certain prisoners were unavailable for transfer." Will studied Schaefer's face, trying to understand the subtext of this conversation. "Are you suggesting something, Herr Oberst?" "I am suggesting nothing," Schaefer replied firmly. "I am merely informing you of 2 facts. First, that you are scheduled for transfer in 3 days. Second, that I will be conducting an inventory of the camp's southern storage facilities tomorrow night between 2200 and 2300 hours, accompanied by all available guards." The implication was clear, yet so carefully phrased that it gave Schaefer plausible deniability. He was offering Will another chance to escape, this time with a full hour during which the southern section of the camp would be minimally guarded. "That's valuable information," Will said carefully. "Thank you for keeping me informed of camp operations." Schaefer nodded once, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "How you may go, Sergeant. I suggest you use your remaining time here wisely." Will stood but hesitated before turning to leave. "May I ask a personal question, Herr Oberst?" "You may ask," Schaefer replied, non-committal. "Why have you helped me? From the beginning, the library, the translations, even now, why me specifically?" Schaefer considered the question for a long moment. "Perhaps because you remind me that humanity transcends the artificial boundaries we create. Perhaps because, in another life, we might have been colleagues at Heidelberg or Harvard, debating Goethe and Shakespeare as scholars rather than as captor and captive." He shrugged slightly. Or perhaps simply because your situation offends my sense of order. You should be judged by your mind, not your skin. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was more honest than Will had expected. Thank you, Herr Oberst, for everything. Schaefer's expression turned solemn. Don't thank me yet, Sergeant Holloway. The war is far from over, and survival is never guaranteed, especially for men who find themselves on the wrong side of history's turning page. As Will left the office, he felt a strange mixture of emotions: hope at the possibility of escape, anxiety about the risks involved, and an unexpected sadness at the thought of leaving behind the complex relationship he had developed with Oberst Wilhelm Schaefer, a German officer who had somehow become something closer to a mentor than an enemy. But sentiment had no place in wartime calculations. Will had 3 days to plan an escape, not just for himself but potentially for others. The question was who to trust with this information and opportunity. Will's first thought was Jenkins, the only other black airman in the camp, and someone who would face similar dangers if transferred to an SS-controlled facility. But Jenkins's status as an officer complicated matters. His absence would be noticed immediately, and as a recent arrival, he lacked the detailed knowledge of camp routines that might aid in escape. After careful consideration, Will approached Sergeant Michael Cooper, who had been originally scheduled to escape with Reynolds months earlier, before being replaced by Technical Sergeant Miller. Cooper had been preparing for escape then. He would have the skills and mindset needed now. Tomorrow night, Will explained in whispered conversation during the evening meal. Southern storage area, 1-hour window. Cooper's eyes widened slightly, but he gave no other reaction. How many? 2, maybe 3 at most, Will replied. More would be too conspicuous. Who else are you telling? Will hesitated. I thought perhaps Jenkins, but an officer would be missed too quickly, Cooper finished the thought. What about Parker? He's been mapping the area beyond the fence for months. Parker was a British RAF navigator with a photographic memory and a talent for creating detailed maps from minimal information. His skills would be invaluable once outside the camp. Good choice, Will agreed. Can you speak to him? Quietly. Cooper nodded. And then, meet in the washroom at 2145 tomorrow. I'll have more details by then. The next 24 hours passed with excruciating slowness. Will continued his normal routines: translation work, library organization, meals with fellow prisoners, while surreptitiously gathering supplies. An extra pair of socks hidden in his jacket. Bread saved from meals dried and tucked into a pocket. A crude compass fashioned from a magnetized needle and a small piece of cork floating in water inside a bottle cap. Most valuable of all was a small map of the region that Will had carefully memorized from Schaefer's office months earlier, now reproduced on a scrap of cloth torn from his undershirt. Switzerland was approximately 300 kilometers to the southwest, a daunting journey through enemy territory, but potentially manageable with luck and careful movement. At 2145 the following night, Will slipped into the washroom to find Cooper already waiting. Parker joined them moments later, his thin face tense with anticipation. Schaefer's inspection begins at 2200, Will explained rapidly. He's taking most of the guards with him to the northern sector. The southern fence near the storage buildings will be minimally guarded for approximately 1 hour. How minimal? Parker asked in his clipped British accent. 1 guard at the corner tower, 1 patrolling. They rotate every 15 minutes. Cooper frowned. Still risky. We'll have to time it precisely, Will agreed. Wait for the patrol to pass, then move during the rotation gap. Parker unfolded a small piece of paper containing his own hand-drawn map. Once outside, we head southwest initially, then due south through this forest. There's a railway line here. He indicated a spot about 5 kilometers from the camp, which we should avoid. Beyond that, farmland for several kilometers before more forest. We'll need to move at night. Hide during daylight, Cooper added. Find food where we can. Will nodded. Switzerland is neutral. If we can reach the border, we'll be safe. The 3 men checked their meager supplies and synchronized their watches. Then, with nothing left to prepare, they waited in tense silence for the appointed time. At precisely 2157, they left the washroom separately. each taking a different path toward the southern edge of the camp. Will moved casually past the barracks, nodding to the few prisoners still outside, giving no indication of his intentions. The night was overcast, with only occasional glimpses of moonlight through breaking clouds, ideal conditions for their purpose. As Will approached the storage area, he could see the inspection activity in the northern section of the camp. Flashlight beams, guards moving in groups, Schaefer's distinctive figure directing operations. In the southern sector, as promised, security was minimal. Will spotted the guard in the corner tower, silhouetted against the sky. The patrolling guard was just completing his circuit. Moving away from the stretch of fence between two storage buildings, Will ducked into the shadow of the nearest storage building, where Cooper was already waiting. Parker joined them moments later, his breathing controlled, but rapid. "Patrol just passed," Cooper whispered. "Next rotation in 12 minutes. We go then," Will decided. The wire. Parker produced a pair of crude wire cutters fashioned from stolen tools. Ready. The minutes crawled by, each second feeling like an eternity as they crouched in the shadows. Will found himself thinking of his father, who had faced prejudice and danger in the previous war, of his mother, who had taught him to find strength in knowledge, of Oberst Schaefer, whose complicated humanity had ultimately given Will this chance at freedom. "Time," Cooper breathed. The tower guard was looking northward, distracted by the inspection activity. The patrol guard had disappeared around the far corner, heading for the rotation point. Their window had arrived. The three men moved swiftly to the fence, staying low. Parker worked rapidly with the wire cutters, the sound of cutting metal terrifyingly loud in Will's ears. After what seemed an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, a section of fence large enough to crawl through had been created. "Go," Will urged, and Parker slipped through the opening. Cooper followed immediately after. As Will prepared to follow, a shout came from the direction of the barracks. He turned to see a figure running toward them, Flight Officer Marcus Jenkins. "Wait!" Jenkins called in a harsh whisper, reaching them in seconds. "Take me with you." Will hesitated. "Jenkins, we can't—" "They're transferring me too," Jenkins interrupted urgently. "SS camp, tomorrow." The same fate Schaefer had warned Will about. For a split second, Will calculated the increased risk of adding a fourth escapee, and an officer at that. But looking at Jenkins' face, he saw the same determination, the same need for freedom that drove him. "Go," Will decided, gesturing to the fence. "Quickly." Jenkins didn't hesitate, diving through the opening. Will followed immediately after, the sharp edges of cut wire catching on his jacket, but failing to hold him. Once through, the four men ran in a crouched position toward the tree line, 50 meters beyond the fence. Will's heart pounded so loudly he was certain it must be audible to the guards. Every instinct screamed at him to run full speed, but training and common sense kept him moving deliberately, minimizing noise and visibility. They reached the trees without alarm being raised, plunging into the darkness of the forest with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Only when they were several hundred meters from the camp did they pause, crouching in a small clearing to orient themselves. "Southwest," Parker whispered, consulting his mental map. "We need to cover as much ground as possible before dawn." "And before they discover we're missing," Jenkins added. "Morning roll call at the latest." "Earlier for you," Cooper pointed out. "Officer's check is at 0600, Jenkins grimaced. "Then we have about 7 hours before the search begins in earnest." Will made a quick decision. "We stick together until first light, then reassess. Move as quietly as possible, maximum distance." The others nodded agreement, and they set off into the darkness, 4 men from different backgrounds united by a common purpose: survival, freedom, and the long journey home. The first night was the hardest. Moving through unfamiliar forest in near total darkness, every sound amplified by fear, every shadow potentially concealing a German patrol. They stumbled often, scratched by branches and bruised by unseen obstacles. Yet they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that each step took them further from captivity. Parker's navigation proved uncannily accurate. Using only the occasional glimpse of stars and his memorized map, he guided them southwest through the forest, avoiding the railway line he had identified earlier. By dawn, They estimated they had covered nearly 15 kilometers, a remarkable distance under the circumstances. As the first light filtered through the trees, they found a dense thicket in which to conceal themselves for the day. Exhausted, they took turns standing watch while the others snatched brief periods of restless sleep. During one such watch, Jenkins settled beside Will, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for not leaving me behind." Will shrugged slightly. "Couldn't leave you to the SS." Still. Jenkins studied Will's face in the dappled morning light. "Most men would have chosen the safer option. 4 is riskier than 3. "Maybe," Will acknowledged, "but we've got better odds together. Your officer training, Parker's navigation, Cooper's survival skills." "And your languages," Jenkins added. 9 of them. Will smiled faintly. "Let's hope we only need German for this trip, and not to surrender." Jenkins returned the smile, a moment of shared gallows humor that somehow made their desperate situation more bearable. That evening, as they prepared to move again, they discussed their strategy moving forward. Cooper suggested splitting into pairs to minimize the chance of all being captured together. But Parker countered that their skills were complementary and essential for the group's collective survival. "Together," Will decided. "At least until we're closer to the border. Then we can reassess." The pattern established itself over the following days. Travel by night, hide by day, scavenging food where possible. They raided a farmhouse garden for vegetables, caught fish in a small stream using improvised spears, even managed to steal eggs from a chicken coop without alerting the farmer. Their German language skills proved invaluable, allowing them to understand snatches of conversation from patrols or villagers, gleaning information about search efforts and local conditions. Will, with his fluent German, occasionally ventured closer to settlements to listen for useful intelligence, though always with extreme caution. On the 4th night, they encountered their first serious obstacle, a military checkpoint on a road they needed to cross. Hidden in the underbrush, they observed the German soldiers checking vehicles and papers, clearly alert for escapees. "We can't go back," Cooper whispered. "We've got the Rhine coming up. This might be the only crossing point for kilometers." "And we can't just walk through the checkpoint?" Jenkins added unnecessarily. Will studied the situation, noting the pattern of the guards, the vehicles passing through, the terrain on either side. "We wait," he decided. "Watch for a gap in their attention." The opportunity came shortly before dawn. A farmer's truck loaded with hay approached the checkpoint from the opposite direction. As the guards stopped the vehicle for inspection, Will nudged the others. "There's our distraction," he whispered. "When they're checking the truck, we cross the ditch on the far side one by one. Use the truck as cover." The plan worked perfectly. While the guards were occupied with searching the hay truck, the 4 escapees slipped across the road one at a time, diving into the drainage ditch on the far side and crawling until they reached the safety of trees beyond. By the 6th day, exhaustion and hunger were taking their toll. Their initial supplies were long gone, and opportunities to scavenge food had been limited. All 4 men had lost weight, their uniforms hanging loosely on increasingly gaunt frames. Yet they had covered nearly 150 kilometers, halfway to Switzerland. Another week at this pace, Parker calculated, assuming no major delays. A major delay, however, was precisely what they encountered the following night. As they approached the Rhine River, the most significant geographical barrier on their route, they discovered that all crossings were heavily guarded. Bridges were patrolled, boats were secured or under watch, and the river itself was too wide and swift to swim safely. "We're trapped," Cooper said grimly after their 3rd attempt to find a crossing point failed. "They've locked down the whole river." "Not necessarily," Will countered, thinking rapidly. "We need a boat, or something that floats." "And where do we get that without being seen?" Jenkins asked. Will considered the problem. "We can't steal one from the guarded areas. We need to make our own." For the next day, hidden in a dense copse near the river, they gathered materials, fallen logs, branches, vines for binding. With Parker's engineering knowledge and Cooper's practical skills, they constructed a crude raft, barely large enough for the 4 of them, but potentially sufficient to cross the river. That night, during a heavy rainstorm that reduced visibility but made their task more miserable, They dragged the raft to a secluded spot on the riverbank. The crossing was harrowing. The swift current immediately threatened to tear their makeshift craft apart. Will and Jenkins paddled desperately with improvised oars, while Cooper and Parker bailed water that seeped through the gaps. "We're not going to make it," Cooper shouted over the rain. "Keep paddling," Will commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had sustained them for days. Miraculously, they reached the opposite shore just as their raft began to disintegrate beneath them. Exhausted but alive, the four men collapsed on the muddy bank, allowing themselves only minutes of rest before continuing their journey. 3 days later, after narrowly avoiding multiple German patrols, they crossed into Switzerland under cover of darkness. Swiss border guards found them at dawn, 4 emaciated men in tattered uniforms supporting each other as they stumbled forward. "Wir sind amerikanische Flieger," Will explained in perfect German, then repeated in flawless French for good measure. "Nous sommes des aviateurs américains." The guards, impressed by Will's linguistic abilities, quickly arranged for medical care and safe transport to Allied representatives in Bern. Months later, after debriefing and recovery, Will Holloway stood before a committee of senior officers in London, recounting their escape. When asked about Oberst Schaefer, Will chose his words carefully. "He was a German who remembered he was a human being first," Will said simply. After the war ended, William Holloway returned to Harvard for his doctorate in linguistics. He became a distinguished professor at Howard University, where he established one of the nation's first centers for international language studies. In 1965, while attending an academic conference in Munich, he encountered an elderly man in the university library, Wilhelm Schaefer, now a history professor once again. "9 languages," Schaefer said with a smile of recognition, "though your German accent has improved considerably." 10 now," Will replied. "I've added Arabic." The 2 former enemies, now simply scholars, spent the afternoon discussing literature, war, and the power of language to bridge even the deepest divides. Years later, when asked about his extraordinary war experience, Professor William Holloway would simply say, "Words built bridges where weapons had created walls. My languages weren't just skills, they were proof that humanity transcends the artificial boundaries we create." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.